again, and he wrote that the Pishnavist is neither Islamic nor revolutionary. It is modeled more on Montesquieu and unapplicable socialism and less on the Quran, and is actually much weaker than the Mashruta constitution. This was the criticism that, by the way, even the Hezb Zahmat Keshan produced regarding the June text. And this was his article against it. As we said earlier, Ayatollah Shar Madari was in favor of the Majlis Muassasan. He came out strongly in favor of it after Khomeini's text. And then there was a relatively unknown cleric called Sayyid Muhammad Khatami, who later would become more famous. And he argued in an editorial for Etelat newspaper that the Khordad text was nothing more than an attempt to impose on the nation what Shapur Bakhtiar had in mind after the Shah's departure from Iran. And he stated, contrary to Montazeri, and we can see the difference between them, that if really there has to be a president, a strong, unitary president, well, that person has to be Imam Khomeini. And he also stated that the president should not operate alone. There should be a new council called the Council of Mujtahids, whose only role would be to supervise on the president all the time. So the president was a sort of a child which could not be left out of the house alone. Well, it's interesting how Khatami later became president, and once he became president, he was not in favor of a Council of Mujtahids to supervise himself. And this is part of his criticism. This appeared in a commentary article on Etelat newspaper, so it had a lot of circulation. And this is another part of Khatami's article. What happened? So as we said in Khordad, at the beginning of Khordad, there was the elections for the Assembly of Experts. And these elections were interesting because except a couple of organizations which pulled out of the contest at the end, such as the Jabhat Milli, Jabhat Demokratique Milli, or people linked to Ayatollah Shar Madari. For example, the entire Central Committee of the Tudeh Party, Kianuri, Tabari, Maryam Firuz, and everybody else, they ran in the Tehran constituency where all the famous personalities participated. Masoud Rajavi was also a candidate for the Mujahideen Khalq, and some of the framers of the initial constitution, such as Nasser Khatruzian and Laiji, were also candidates. And of course, all the known people linked to Khomeini and clerics, Montazeri, Taleghani, Bani Saad. So the Tehran constituency results gives you some sort of an idea of how popular these people were, 4 or 5 months after the votes after the fall of the Shah's regime. So what were the results? 2 million votes for Taleghani, who was the first person who won basically the elections. Of course, Taleghani was very popular. Over 1 million for Bani Saad, Golzadeh, and Montazeri. Here are some of the results. The entire Central Committee of the Tudeh Party polling no more than 100,000 votes. Remember, Taleghani alone got 2 million votes, Kianuri, Maryam Firuz, and everybody else got 100,000 votes. Masoud Rajavi got 297,000 votes. Less than a tenth of what Taleghani was getting. So the Mujahideen were popular, but their popularity was not comparable to what these clerical figures had or were. These are the results from Kehan newspaper of the time. But the Assembly of Experts results were also, some of the groups charged fraud, and some of the groups said that in various parts of the countries, less in Tehran, because in Tehran the Bazagan cabinet was in power and had control over the electoral offices, but in other parts of the country there was evidence of rigging, according to them. But these elections were important because for the first time they highlighted the emergence of a very important entity in the country, and that's the Islamic Republic Party. And as you see this title from Andegan newspaper 2 days before it shut down, suddenly for the first time the Hezb Jumhuriya Islami becomes an important player in the country. Suddenly people wake up and realize that this party, which was formed in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Shah's regime, it wasn't one of the parties like the other ones which was present before the revolution, suddenly gets way ahead of all these other famous people belonging to Kanun Vukala or the Hezb Tudeh or other parties, and suddenly becomes the first political organization of the country. Ayan Degan starts running a series of articles on these elections, on how good they were and how sort of what the validity of these elections was, and it publishes its last issue on the 16th of Mordad with this title. This is Hassan Nazieh. He was the head of the Kanun Vukala in the revolutionary period, and he claims that the elections were not valid. The next day, on a pretense, Ayandagan gets closed, and this was the start of repression against media in the post-revolutionary period. And Ayandagan was, in my view, the most interesting newspaper of contemporary Iranian history. But it gets closed because, again, of the elections of the Majlis Muassisan. I'm coming to the conclusion, so we can have a lunch soon. On August 19, the Assembly of Experts finally meets, and they start debating the constitution. And by that time, the clergy and the people linked to Khomeini realized their strength. They realized that through these elections, they have considerable control over society, and they have the popularity needed for overcoming the problems and errors they saw with the Pishnevi Salam Asasi, and that's what they do. Under the chairmanships of Ayatollah Montazeh Beheshti and the impetus of Hassan Ayat, Articles 5 and 110, which consolidate the Velayat Faqih proposition, and they place it on top of the Pishnevi's text, come into being, and Montazeri's criticism comes to fruition. And during this process, of course, Khomeini never really complains, and he's never really against the imposition of Velayat Faqih. So a few concluding points at the very end of the speech. Was the Pishnevis secular? Well, is this true that a secular text came up, Ayatollah Khomeini asked for it to be put to direct referendum? Well, this is not entirely correct. The only text that appears to have been possible to put in front of a direct referendum was the Esfand one, which, as we saw, contained veto powers for the clergy. Khomeini never really called for the Khodad one to be placed directly to a popular vote. And as we saw, by the time he started making his critiques against Majlis Muassisan at the end of Khodad, there was a deal already reached in Qom for the creation of a Majlis Khobregan of 75 people, and therefore he was acting in a very political way and in a very clever way in order to derail the attempts of people like Shari Madari and Bazargan and go towards the creation of this Majlis Khobregan that he hunched at least would be led by his supporters, because the rules for the election of Majlis Khobregan was one member for every 500,000 people in Iran, and this meant that entire rural areas would be under the control of local clergy, and that's how a lot of supporters of Khomeini filled the Assembly of Experts. But let's, as the very last slide, let's see this slide, which is interesting, because once the final text of the Constitution becomes approved, there is a lot of complaints to it. The Mujahideen Khalq boycott the referendum for the confirmation of the final Velayat Faqih text. The National Front does the same, Jabhat Milli, Jabhat Democratic Milli, and all these small organizations. But the most important criticism, again, comes from the clergy. And as we were saying in previous speeches, the clergy was never united in Iran in big incidents. They were united, they were disunited, divided during the Mashruta period, divided during the Mossadegh coup d'etat period, and they were divided in this very important initial stages of the revolution as well. And Sharia Madari, Ayatollah Sharia Madari produces a fatwa in which he states that the Articles 5 and 110 are contrary to the principle of national sovereignty or Hakimiyat Millat, as he was earlier stating, and unless those are changed, he will not support this constitution, this final text. And those were not changed, and there was a lot of disturbances in Azerbaijan and Tabriz, which were obviously his strongholds over this. And in that box, you can see the way through which the government had to come to terms with Sharia Madari's missed approval of the constitution by reading a fatwa which was written by his brother, who was a Hujjatul Islam, and putting his photo instead of his brother's photo on television. And this really brings me to an end of the speech. And in this, I wanted to show the way through which the initial constitution writing process occurred in Iran after the revolution, the way through which the clergy managed to maneuver its way into the approval of the Velayat Faqih, and in a certain way realize the complexity of this process, which was not easy and it was not immediate. Thank you very much.